symptomatic of how, while the likes of us are quite engaged in everything to do with the independence referendum, actually out there in the real world, in real people's lives, they don't really care. They're not really engaged. It's not really on at the forefront of people's consciousness. If the referendum was tomorrow, we might be struggling to reach 30% turnout because the arguments haven't been made. And I suppose people see it as quite far away. But as an exercise, I think it's most welcome. And the more types of debates that we have like this in universities, and I would say schools as well, I think it's absolutely appalling that at this stage nobody is advocating, at least publicly, that schools through the Curriculum for Excellence should be engaging in this debate. And I find that appalling because, and it was somebody who a while ago made a comment on a blog post that I had, I think about 16 and 17-year-olds voting, was that his 93-year-old granny would get a vote and she could pop her clogs, and that was his words, not mine, shortly thereafter, but that children don't have any say in it, and actually they are the ones who live with our decisions. And I think it's really important that children and young people from the youngest age are facilitated and supported to at least debate the ideas. And even from a kind of selfish perspective, in terms of being a yes supporter and an advocate of independence, there's pester power at work there. I have no doubt that children and young people would be debating it, would be coming home chattering about it, and actually bringing it to the tea table and into their parents' lives and making them think about it. And if children get behind the idea, and they do tend to be more pro-independence, as all the kind of mock elections in schools have shown, then that could actually only be a good thing in terms of pester power working to persuade their parents.
I think that's compelling, and I must say, despite the slightly maybe cynical bent of my opening question there, I'm not necessarily against this process at all. I think that I'm sure it was a nice hook to try and stimulate debate on campus about these kind of issues, and I think that's a really good thing. And I don't think we can discipline conversation by the sort of persistent partisan logic of what tomorrow's Scotsman headline might do for the Yes campaign. I think that's not a kind of battle which I'm really willing to get engaged in, nor do I think that young folk should do so either. I mean, that's the preserve of your crusty old middle-aged Labour Party and SNP press officer. It shouldn't be governing how we kind of behave in this campaign for me. And I think your point about schools is very well taken, actually. I mean, if we're gonna take this debate into people's lives, then the best place to do it is to relate to the kind of institutions which people are participating in. And I know, Michael, you've been doing some podcasts which have been focusing on football, and I'm, as you know, not a major football fan, or not even a minor football fan, not even a vanishingly small football fan. But your point is, I think, absolutely right, that these are kind of effective societies, units in which people congregate, have discussions, make arguments. And if we're going to really reach people, we have to reach those kind of institutions and societies that they're part of.
Yeah, the football fans is kind of second-class citizens. I don't know if it's a thing related to Tory governments, because it's very much the attitude towards it's very much gone back to the way it was around the kind of Hillsborough time and the way people are being treated. And just as a general shout-out, I think with the offensive behaviour bill, they're doing so much damage to themselves. But on the topic of Glasgow Uni, I went there as well, and I was involved, worked there as well, and no stranger to student politics of Glasgow University, and can be a bit strange. For example, when I was there, the different rectors were Ross Kemp, Greg Hemphill, then they couldn't find anyone, and then they went directly to Mordecai Vanunu, which is a kind of strange group of people. I'm trying to imagine the meeting, Ross Kemp and Mordecai Vanunu. But although not as strange as some, like I once went to St Andrews, and I didn't go to St Andrews, but I was in St Andrews University Union, and I saw a poster up for a Stop the War, Cheese and Wine. Good grief, they do.
You mean sort of stopping the bombs one bottle of Pinot at a time?
Yeah, they do things differently there, I think. But
as a St Andrews graduate, yes, very kind of strange approach to politics. But I would point out that in the 80s, when I was there, we actually were the architects of testing against Thatcher's cuts to higher education, and it was St Andrews, that hotbed of kind of radical street protest, which actually led the way. And the NUS at the time, we weren't an NUS university then, but they actually persuaded all the other NUS universities to get involved, and we actually had a Scottish movement, and it was led by, St Andrews, bizarrely at the time, given, all the kind of right-wing connections and stuff, but yeah, so...
Yeah, so that's you chasing Michael. St Andrews, the bastion of radicalism in Scotland in the 80s.
No, I didn't mean it that way, but just on the Glasgow front, I mean, the politics of Glasgow Uni are a bit odd, and because there's the two university unions, there tends to be a general division. And I know this doesn't hold for everyone, but you would generally find that the Glasgow University Union would be the one that was more kind of unionist and to the right, whereas the Queen Margaret Union would be the ones that was more the people who are more to the left and probably would be more likely to support independence. But also those people are probably the ones that were least likely to vote in it as well.
Well, actually, au contraire, I once saw a Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament attempt to get into the Queen Margaret Union in Glasgow University on a cheesy pop night. So there you are. It was one of the most interesting experiences of my life.
Well, I once saw the British Army get chased out of the Queen Margaret Union because they were trying to recruit in there without permission.
Oh, there you go. Mm-hmm. Actually, that was one of the reasons why I was interested, and I think maybe both what you said there, Michael and Kate, touch on this about this Glasgow vote, was the fact that Glasgow is one of the few ancient universities in Scotland which has a more substantial domestic student body. I mean, I studied in Edinburgh, which had lots of folk in it in law school from Scotland, but the arts and humanities were very dominated, just impressionistically, I found, by folk from south of the border, whereas the same isn't true in Glasgow, and I don't have the stats to hand, but I'm pretty sure that backs up that proposition. So that was one of the reasons why I was a wee bit interested in this independence referendum that they were running, partly because Glasgow Uni it's not perhaps the same as St Andrews and Edinburgh in terms of the kind of profile of the student body, in terms of their origins. Not, of course, that there aren't English folk that would vote for independence, but I suspect if you were a well-heeled arts and humanities student in Edinburgh Uni from Sussex, then you're not likely to be an obvious candidate to vote for Scottish independence. Pretty sure that's not too controversial. Anyway, maybe that would be a nice moment to move from urban studentdom to more rural pursuits. Kate, you had a particular story that caught your attention this week from Rassay. Do you want to have a wee chat about that?
Yeah, I'll try and not misrepresent what happened, the situation. It basically pertains to the fact that Rassay crofters quite a while ago obtained the shooting rights on Rassay because nobody wanted them, basically, and they got them dirt cheap, and they paid, I think it was about £600 a year for the rights. And the crofters organised themselves, worked as a cooperative, invested in fencing, and basically making the prospect of shooting on Rassay an attractive proposition. And this seems to have caught the eye of the Scottish Government, who then put the shooting rights out to tender, and the Rassay crofters increased their bid for it, and I think there were about 6 bids or something went in, but even though they had increased the amount they were prepared to pay for the shooting rights, they lost out to a commercial firm based in South Ayrshire. And of course, needless to say, the Rassay crofters are absolutely spitting mad about it, because they're the ones who, through their own endeavours, turned it into an attractive proposition, and everybody wants to kind of make profit on the back of their hard work. For me, what's really interesting about the story is it's almost, it's everything that I would never have thought an SNP government would allow to happen in lots of ways, because it's kind of the little people losing out to bigger commercial interests. But it's also kind of linked into land reform as well. And, in opposition, I remember when the Land Reform Bill went through in Parliament, and Rosanna Cunningham and others were hugely passionate advocates of the need for land reform in Scotland, and pushed and harried that bill. And actually, I think, it's not perfect. I'm not Andy Whiteman. I couldn't kind of distill down all its faults. It's not by any manner of means the most radical piece of legislation on land reform, and it's not as radical as it could have been. But certainly, the SNP were really passionate at the time about pushing and harrying on it, and secured some improvements to it. But since then, and I think as Andy Whiteman and others have blogged and pointed out, they've allowed land reform as an issue to kind of wither on the vine since they came into power in 2007. And the idea that, a small shooting rights on a crofting island, if you like, can then be put out to a company that has no ties with the island, has no stake in creating a sustainable future, is just everything that's wrong, if you like, with land ownership and proprietorial rights. And I think it kind of smacks of where we are in terms of almost that the SNP government is scared to appear to be too radical on things that might cause us douche, because it's trying to be everybody's pal at the moment and trying to persuade everybody to vote yes. But the big risk of that is that people like the small number of Rathie crofters, admittedly, who might, have voted yes for a better future, are now kind of feeling very aggrieved.
I wonder, one question about this controversy, and I imagine maybe, Kate, you're not in a position to give a definitive answer in this one, was about the sort of decision-making structure and who was actually involved. Because I suppose the interpretation you just put on that there is that ministers substantively made this decision and presumably did so on the basis of where the most money would come from, as opposed to valuing other things such as, sustainability in communities and other, I think, fundamentally important questions like that. For me, I kind of wonder if this was one of these pieces of paper that was put under the ministerial nose, which wasn't read properly and was then signed. And if it was signed, I mean, I know that there's some discussion about revising this kind of policy and decision. But presumably if property rights are involved, then actually there's only relatively limited scope to do things like that actually this may well be a decision which the crofters of Rathie are stuck with.
Yeah, and I even suspect that, I think you're absolutely right, Andrew, that it probably was dealt with under delegated powers. Ministers probably got nowhere near it, but then, the ministers set the tone and the culture for the government, the kind of government they want to run. Civil servants and no doubt ministers would now kind of try to defend the decision on the basis of all the best value stuff. No doubt a reference to Europe would be thrown in there for good measure, but ultimately, it's small beer. There is probably a duty to the public purse in terms of bringing in money, but it's not the only thing that counts. And we have procurement legislation. There is a procurement bill going through the Parliament at the moment. I don't know enough about it, but I think part of that was part of the rationale behind the procurement bill is so that you can take other things into account. There is best value legislation that Labour passed that means that you don't cost and kind of income are not the only factors you have to take into account in tendering processes. But sadly, it does seem to be that is the only game in town. And I think you're absolutely right. It possibly is one of those that was kind of in the pile of papers that a minister has to sign off, and it just kind of passed them by. But at the end of the day, they are accountable, and civil servants work with the rules of the land. But it doesn't mean to say that the rules are correct.
No, I think that's perfectly reasonable. Michael, do you want to come in on that issue there?
Yeah, it was just in his answer, didn't Salmond, someone asked it in First Minister's questions about this during the week there, didn't Salmond kind of fudge it and say there's a limited amount we can do, kind of not within my purview to deal with it? I thought he kind of fudged it.
I missed that. I have to say, FMQs manages to pass me by most weeks, which I think is it's a good thing by. But no, I mean, that's a really interesting response, because you can understand why he's saying that, because if the First Minister takes responsibility for everything. You're back into kind of blankets on beds in Royal Alexandra Hospital, and